The silence didn't break with a scream. It broke with a whisper. A single sentence, released late at night, trembling with grief and rage, sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. "My father didn't just die," the youngest daughter said. "Something was taken from us. And the truth hasn't caught up yet." That was all. No cameras. No press conference. No carefully rehearsed statement from a publicist. Just words. Raw, unfiltered, and terrifying. What really happened inside that gated estate on the hill? Why did the story change so many times in the first 48 hours? And why did one voice, silent until now, wait so long before speaking? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Tonight, we begin at the moment before everything collapsed. Because to understand the mystery, you first have to understand the family. A family the world thought it knew. From the outside, the Reiner name represented legacy, power, creative royalty, decades of laughter, applause, red carpets, and awards. A household where stories were currency and success seemed inevitable. The kind of family people described as Hollywood's first family. But inside that house, behind the iron gates and manicured hedges, something was quietly rotting. And almost no one noticed. Let's rewind. The estate sat high above the city, perched in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods money could buy. $13 million of glass, stone, and security. The kind of place designed to keep the world out and secrets in. On paper, everything looked perfect. A legendary director approaching his late 70s. A wife known for her philanthropy and quiet strength. Adult children scattered across careers in entertainment and business. And a youngest daughter, Romy, long described as the sensitive one, the artist, the observer. But what happens when the observer sees too much? According to people who knew the family well, friends, former staff, distant relatives, tension had been building for years. Not loud, explosive tension. The dangerous kind. The quiet kind. The kind that simmers. Arguments that ended abruptly when someone walked into the room. Family dinners that grew shorter. Phone calls that went unanswered. And then there was the guest house. It sat just far enough away from the main residence to offer privacy. Independence. Distance. That's where the eldest son, Nick, lived. Close enough to be family. Far enough to be separate. At least, that was the idea. Neighbors would later tell investigators they noticed more police visits to the property than usual. Wellness checks. Noise complaints that went nowhere. Raised voices late at night. Doors slamming. A sense that something wasn't right. But never quite enough to intervene. Until the night, everything ended. Sunday evening. The city was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before a storm or after one has already passed. When authorities arrived, they found a scene so violent it shocked even veteran detectives. 2 lives ended. A house turned into a crime scene. A family shattered in a single night. The official report was brief. Almost sterile. A double homicide. Multiple stab wounds. No signs of forced entry. And then came the arrest. Nick, the son, the brother, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The headlines exploded. Hollywood dynasty destroyed. Son accused in brutal slayings. Family tragedy turns criminal. But something strange happened almost immediately. The narrative froze. No press interviews from the children. No emotional statements. No tearful courthouse footage. Just silence. Days passed. Then weeks. And during that silence, rumors filled the void. Online forums dissected every photo. Body language experts analyzed old interviews. True crime creators speculated wildly. Some said it was a long-simmering family feud. Others whispered about money, inheritance, control. A few even suggested the story being told wasn't the whole story at all. And through it all, Romy said nothing. Until she did. Her statement didn't come through a lawyer. It didn't come through a studio. It came through a cracked voice recording shared privately, then leaked. "I've been quiet because I was scared," she said. Not just of losing them, but of what happens when you start asking the wrong questions. That sentence alone changed everything. Scared of what? Of whom? And why now? Romy was always different from her siblings. While others leaned into the spotlight, she leaned away. While the family name opened doors, she often chose rooms with no audience at all. Friends describe her as deeply empathetic, intensely emotional. The kind of person who remembers things others forget. Tones, Pauses, looks exchanged across rooms. And that's important, because when the official story says one thing, and the observer remembers another, that's where cracks begin to form. In her statement, Romy didn't accuse anyone directly. She didn't name names, but she used language that raised alarms. Words like contradictions, missing hours, things that don't line up. She spoke about the last time she saw her father. About the way he hugged her, not like a goodbye, but like a warning. He held on longer than usual, she said, like he was trying to tell me something without words. That detail never appeared in police reports. Neither did her claim that her mother had planned to leave the house the following morning. A meeting, a bag packed, a reason not to be there. So why was she? And why did no one talk about it? Romy's voice cracked when she reached the part that haunted her most. The house was supposed to be empty that night, she said. Except it wasn't. That single line sent a chill through anyone who heard it. Empty, except it wasn't. Who else was there? And why wasn't it mentioned? As the public digested her words, pressure mounted on investigators to clarify timelines. But instead of answers, more silence followed. Evidence sealed. Case files restricted. Court dates postponed. And then came the most disturbing claim of all. One Romy never intended to make public. He wasn't just attacked, she said quietly. What was done to him felt personal. That word, personal, it suggested rage, overkill, emotion beyond impulse. And suddenly, people began asking a question no one wanted to ask. What if this wasn't just a crime of violence, but a crime of history? Of years of resentment, of secrets buried under success, of wounds that never healed. As the youngest child, Romy grew up watching everything. Absorbing tension she didn't yet understand, seeing patterns others dismissed. And now, with her family gone and her brother behind bars, she was standing alone between two impossible truths. The truth the world accepted, and the truth she believed had been ignored. So why speak now? Because, according to Romy, something happened after the arrest that terrified her more than the murders themselves. Something that made her realize staying silent might be worse. I was warned, she said. Not directly, but clearly. Warned by whom? And warned about what? That's where our story truly begins. The first question anyone asks when tragedy strikes a famous family is simple. How could this happen here? In the house that had been a fortress, surrounded by walls, alarms, and security cameras? How could it happen in a neighborhood so quiet it seemed unreal? But the answer isn't simple. Because in families like this, the danger often doesn't come from outside. It comes from inside. Romy remembered that Sunday clearly, even though the memory made her stomach turn every time. She had been across town, meeting a friend for coffee, the scent of roasted beans and pastries masking the thoughts that wouldn't leave her. Are they safe? She called her father twice that morning. Twice. And both times, the line went unanswered. At first, she assumed he was busy. After all, he had a long history of staying late at work, poring over scripts and production notes. But a creeping unease settled in her chest, one she couldn't shake. Her brother Nick was supposed to be at the guest house, a separate space, meant to provide distance. Romy trusted him, as much as one could trust a sibling who had always been a bit unpredictable. But something felt off. By the time she returned home that afternoon, the neighborhood had shifted. Police cars, unmarked SUVs, and flashing lights blocked the usual calm driveways. Neighbors whispered in small clusters, eyes wide, fingers pointing discreetly. The estate she had grown up in, her sanctuary, her childhood castle, felt suddenly foreign, even threatening. When she stepped inside, Romy realized the world had changed. Not gradually, but violently. The estate, which had always smelled of cedar wood and fresh flowers, now carried an acrid tang that made her gag. That smell, she would later say, was not just blood. It was fear, anger, something almost alive. Detectives and crime scene officers moved systematically. Tape crisscrossed the hallways. Evidence markers littered the polished floors. Cameras recorded angles of the living room, kitchen, and hallways. Angles Romy would never forget. But the most haunting part? The silence where her parents once lived. No laughter. No arguments. No smell of coffee in the morning. Just the emptiness. Romy's first instinct was disbelief. Surely this had to be a mistake. Some surreal nightmare that would fade once she woke up. She ran to her father's study, the room that smelled faintly of leather and old books. It was there she noticed the small details that would haunt her forever. A half-filled mug of coffee, still warm. A chair pushed back as if someone had left in a hurry. A notepad with scribbled notes in her father's handwriting. It was mundane, ordinary, and yet it screamed of sudden disruption. She remembered thinking, he was here. He was alive. And then, the words wouldn't come. The detectives approached her cautiously, recognizing her as family, but unsure how much she knew. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "We'll need to ask you some questions," he said. Romy nodded. She wanted to scream. She wanted answers. But all she could manage was a trembling. "I need to see them." That simple request became a labyrinth. They could not allow her to see her parents' bodies. Protocols. Legal constraints. They explained it as gently as possible. But Romy saw the truth in their eyes. The scene had been so violent, so personal, that even seasoned officers were shaken. That's when she learned the first shocking fact. Something that had never been reported. Something that no one outside that house would know until much later. Her father had been stabbed over 100 times. 100 times. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was deliberate. Methodical. Overkill. A statement of rage that no one could understand, at least not yet. Romy's mind raced. Who could harbor that much anger? Who could cross the line so completely? And then the other details surfaced. Her mother. Her gentle, patient mother, who had dedicated decades to charity and family. She too had been attacked. But there was something different about her wounds, something that suggested desperation, resistance, an attempt to survive. Romy's stomach churned as detectives carefully walked her through what they could reveal. Timelines, entry points, witness statements, odd inconsistencies in her brother's accounts. And then the first whisper of suspicion reached her ears, not from the press, not from gossip, but from the detectives themselves. "We have questions about Nick," one officer said quietly, as if even saying his name aloud carried weight. Nick, her brother, her blood. The word felt heavy in her mouth. She wanted to deny it, to dismiss it as impossible. But deep down, a cold, rational part of her began piecing things together. He had access. He lived in the guest house. He knew the house, the routines, the schedules. Could he really be involved? The thought was unbearable. But worse was the secret she had always known. The tension between her brother and her parents had been escalating for years. Small, silent battles, buried beneath the surface of family dinners, social media posts, and public appearances. But Romy had noticed. She had always noticed. And she had worried. She hadn't known why. She just knew something didn't feel right. Now she did. The detectives left her in the study, a quiet room filled with memories and shadows. Romy sank into the leather chair, staring at her father's half-written notes. The words seemed meaningless now, scraps of a life interrupted. But then her gaze fell on one line, almost hidden, a reminder about a meeting. A business call scheduled for that very night. One she knew her mother had planned to attend as well. Except neither of them made it. Why? Romy felt an icy weight settle in her chest. Something was missing. Something crucial. And she had a sinking feeling it had to do with that meeting, and with someone in the house who shouldn't have been there. As she sat there, trying to make sense of the chaos, she realized the media had already started to spin the story. Headlines jumped to conclusions. Family feuds, mental instability, financial motives. Every theory was plausible. Every theory was incomplete. And Romy knew one terrifying truth. The narrative the world believed might be far from the reality she had lived. Because in families like hers, reality is never simple. And secrets are never fully buried. The night was only beginning. And what Romy was about to discover in the hours following that first visit. Hidden messages, small inconsistencies, whispers from neighbors, and the first leak from law enforcement would change everything she thought she knew about her family, about her brother, and about herself. But for now, she could only sit, staring at the study, at her father's scattered notes, at the empty chairs where they had once laughed, and wonder. How do you move forward when the world you thought was real has been ripped away? Because the answers weren't just waiting for her. They were waiting for someone willing to look deeper, someone willing to confront the unthinkable. And Romy, whether she liked it or not, was that someone. The first hours after the tragedy blurred into a nightmare that Romy would never escape. The house that had once been a place of safety and laughter now felt like a mausoleum. Every step echoed too loudly. Every whisper sounded like an accusation. As she moved from room to room, Romy noticed details she had never paid attention to before. The framed family photos on the walls, smiling faces frozen in time, suddenly seemed sinister. Each snapshot of birthday parties, premieres, and holiday gatherings became a silent reminder of everything that had been lost. Her parents' study, already haunting, revealed its own mysteries. The scattered papers weren't just remnants of daily life. They were clues. Notes with cryptic scribbles, calendars with appointments crossed out, phone numbers half erased, and in the margin of one notebook, a single word repeated over and over. Trust. Trust. The word hit Romy harder than anything else she had seen that day. She knew immediately what it meant. It wasn't just a reminder to her father. It was a warning, a premonition, and as she stared at it, questions began to consume her. Who could she trust now? Who could she believe? And most importantly, what had her brother done while the rest of the family slept, oblivious to the violence that would soon consume them? Outside, the media frenzy intensified. Rumors ran wild. Journalists camped outside the estate gates. Paparazzi drones hovered overhead. Every passing car became a potential spy, every neighbor a potential informant. Romy tried to focus on what mattered most. Piecing together the timeline, the missing hours, the tiny inconsistencies that no one else seemed to notice. She knew she was racing against time, and against forces she didn't fully understand. The first person she reached out to was a longtime family friend, a producer who had known the Reiners for decades. She needed answers, or at least some perspective. "I can't believe this," the friend whispered when she answered. "I keep thinking it's a nightmare. I've known them my whole life." "And Nick, I don't understand how it could come to this." "Neither do I," Romy said, her voice breaking. "But there are things that don't add up. The timeline, the guest house, the calls my dad didn't answer. I can't ignore it anymore." The friend hesitated. "You need to be careful, Romy. This is bigger than our family. Bigger than anything you can imagine." "What do you mean?" she asked, heart racing. "There are whispers. People saying the attack wasn't just about anger. Some of the detectives think it was personal, targeted." Romy's stomach dropped. Personal. That word had come up before, in hushed tones and in her own fear-filled thoughts. But now hearing it from someone else, outside the house, gave it weight. It wasn't conjecture anymore. It was a theory being considered by professionals. Later that evening, Romy sat alone in her parents' living room, staring at the grand piano her father had once played. She could almost hear the notes, soft and melancholic, echoing in the empty room. She thought about her father's last hug, the one that felt like a warning, and about her mother, always the quiet protector, who had never deserved any of this. And then she thought about Nick, the brother who had grown up in the same halls, shared the same memories, and yet, according to the world, had become the perpetrator of unimaginable violence. Romy forced herself to replay every memory she had of him. The arguments, the silences, the moments when he seemed angry, distant, or resentful. Nothing screamed murder at the time. But now, in hindsight, each small act seemed loaded with significance, like pieces of a puzzle she had refused to see before. She began to catalog these memories meticulously. Every look, every word, every reaction. And with each recollection, the picture of that night became increasingly complex. The detective's reports had hinted at inconsistencies in his alibi. Small gaps in the timeline. Unexplained movements. And though Romy didn't yet know all the details, the seeds of doubt had been planted. She wondered what would happen if the media uncovered her observations. Would they believe her? Would they think she was biased, too close to see clearly? Or would they finally begin to question the official narrative? Meanwhile, social media exploded. Every theory, every rumor, every wild speculation found its audience. People debated motives, finances, jealousy, and mental health. Some posts were compassionate, others cruel, and many crossed the line into conspiracy territory. Romy realized that in this world, perception mattered as much as reality. And if she wanted the truth to emerge, she had to be strategic. She couldn't let her grief or her anger guide her public statements. Every word could be twisted, every gesture misinterpreted. But even as she planned, her mind kept returning to the night itself. The missing pieces. The small but critical moments that didn't make sense. Why had the security system been disabled? Why had certain doors been unlocked? Why did her brother's statements contradict what she knew to be true about the family's routines? The questions gnawed at her, and every time she tried to rest, her mind replayed a single, terrifying scenario, that the people she loved most had known their end was coming and had been powerless to stop it. It was then that she remembered a call from her father 2 weeks before the tragedy, a call she had almost dismissed at the time. He had sounded nervous, even fearful, but tried to hide it behind humor. "Romy," he had said, "if something ever happens, trust your instincts. Don't let anyone tell you what's real. Pay attention. You'll know." At the time, she thought he was joking, or perhaps just overprotective. Now she understood. He had known. Somehow he had known. And if he had known, then the question became chillingly clear. Who else knew? Romy realized that the investigation wasn't just about finding a perpetrator. It was about uncovering a hidden world, one of family secrets, long-standing resentments, and dangerous truths that had been buried beneath fame and fortune. She knew she couldn't rely solely on law enforcement to reveal the whole picture. They were working within protocols, limited by what evidence could legally be disclosed. She had to dig, carefully, meticulously, and without drawing attention to herself. Her first step was to retrace every call, every text, every interaction her parents had in the weeks leading up to that night. She enlisted the help of close friends she trusted, people who could move discreetly, ask questions without alerting the public, and help piece together the fragments of her family's final days. Each discovery was more unsettling than the last. Messages that didn't add up. Meetings scheduled that her parents never attended. Calls from unknown numbers that were quickly deleted. Each anomaly felt like a breadcrumb leading to something darker. And then came the first real shock, one that no one could have anticipated. A neighbor, someone who had always appeared friendly and ordinary, mentioned seeing someone in the estate late that night. Someone who hadn't been expected. Someone whose presence no one had accounted for. Romy's heart raced. Could it be her brother? Or someone else entirely? Someone connected to her family's past? The thought made her stomach twist. She realized that the story she thought she knew, the narrative painted by headlines, statements, and social media speculation, was incomplete. Entirely incomplete. And that incompleteness was dangerous. Because the truth, Romy realized, was far more personal, far more complex, and far more terrifying than anyone outside the house could imagine. And yet, she also knew that uncovering it could be her only way to honor the lives of the parents she had lost, and perhaps prevent further tragedy. The days following the tragedy felt like walking through fog. Romy moved almost automatically, navigating the estate like a ghost, passing rooms filled with memories that seemed alive and accusatory at the same time. Every object, every photograph, every piece of furniture reminded her of what had been taken, and of the questions no one had answered. One of the first things she noticed was how the house itself seemed to harbor secrets. Doors that normally clicked shut silently now groaned on their hinges. The chandelier in the dining room swayed slightly, even though no breeze passed through the thick walls. Even the sunlight seemed to cut differently across the floors, casting shadows that felt intentional, as if they were pointing out the missing pieces. Romy's instinct, honed over years of observing her parents, told her to pay attention to the smallest details. They often mattered more than anyone realized. The first clue came in the form of a voice message she had almost deleted. It was from her mother, sent the week before the tragedy. "Romy," the message began, hesitant, almost whispered. "If you get this, check the files in the study drawer. Trust no one, not even those closest to you." Romy froze when she listened to it. Her mother had always been calm and measured. For her to leave a message like this suggested fear. Real fear. She rushed to the study and pulled open the drawer. Inside, neatly stacked files bore labels she hadn't noticed before: financial, legal, family matters, and one simply marked Nick. Her hands trembled as she opened the last folder. It contained documents she couldn't understand entirely, but whose implications were terrifying. Transactions, communications, and correspondences that suggested tension, disagreements, and hidden dealings between her brother and other unknown parties. Why hadn't she noticed this before? Had she been too distracted by school, by work, by the everyday life that felt so mundane? Or had her parents kept this deliberately hidden, knowing she wasn't ready? The documents painted a complicated picture. Nick, while charming and talented in public, had a history of financial disputes and subtle manipulations that went unnoticed by most, but clearly distressed his parents. Romy's stomach tightened as she realized that what had seemed like normal sibling tension was far deeper, far more dangerous. But the files were just the beginning. Her mother's message had implied there was more, something beyond finances, something personal, something that might explain the night of the murders. The next revelation came from a neighbor, someone who had always seemed unobtrusive. They mentioned noticing a car parked near the estate at odd hours, just days before the tragedy. It wasn't Nick's car. It wasn't her parents'. It belonged to someone unknown, someone who had been coming and going without leaving a trace. The realization hit Romy like a punch to the stomach. She had been so focused on Nick that she hadn't considered other possibilities. Someone else could have been involved. Someone with motive, with knowledge of the house, with a plan to strike. Romy's mind raced through every interaction in the past months. Every dinner, every visit, every odd phone call. Could any of these moments have been clues? Warnings? Signs of danger she hadn't recognized? She began to map everything out. Every timeline, every known movement, every person who had access. And with each layer, the picture became more tangled, more sinister. That evening, she confronted her brother over the phone. The conversation was strained, tense, and filled with words that seemed carefully chosen. "Nick," she said, voice tight, "I need you to tell me everything. I need the truth." There was a long pause. Then he replied, calm but distant, "Romy, I don't know what you want me to say. You know what happened. I know what the police said. I want the truth." He laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "The truth? You think you can handle it? You think anyone can?" That laugh told her more than words could. He knew something. He knew more than he was letting on. And that terrified her. She spent the night poring over the files, the voice messages, the timelines. Connections emerged. Patterns she had never seen before. Contradictions in statements. Discrepancies in the alibi. Subtle details that had been overlooked. And then she found the most disturbing piece yet. A message from her mother, encrypted in a way only she could understand. It referenced an event from years ago, something that had been buried in the family history, something that might have been the spark for all that had followed. Romy realized she was standing at the edge of a revelation that could shatter everything. The night of the tragedy wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was the culmination of years of hidden conflicts, secrets, and simmering resentment. She felt a cold certainty. Uncovering the truth would be dangerous, not just for her, but for anyone who got too close. And yet, she couldn't stop, because the silence her parents had left behind demanded answers. And every hidden detail she uncovered made the official story, the story the world believed, look more and more like a carefully constructed lie. As dawn broke over the estate, Romy sat in the study, surrounded by papers, messages, and photographs. Her hands ached. Her eyes stung. But she felt a grim resolve settle in her chest. She was going to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. But she had no idea that the next revelation, something hidden in plain sight, something her father had left intentionally, would change her understanding of her family forever. Because some secrets, Romy realized, aren't just buried. They're waiting for the right person to find them. And she had just begun to scratch the surface. The discovery that shook Romy the most didn't come from police reports or the media. It came from a small, unassuming envelope tucked behind a row of books in her father's study, a place she had passed 100 times without noticing anything unusual. Its edges were frayed, yellowed with age, and the handwriting on the front was unmistakable, her father's precise, familiar script. Inside were photographs, not ordinary family snapshots, but images she had never seen before. Pictures of people she didn't recognize, places she couldn't immediately identify, and a few candid shots of her own family, her parents and Nick, taken years ago, yet somehow different. There was an intensity in the photographs, as if her father had been documenting something he suspected, a pattern no one else had noticed. Her hands shook as she turned each image over. Some contained dates, locations, and short cryptic notes. Others were simply marked with a question mark, as if her father himself wasn't sure what he was capturing. One photograph, however, stopped her cold. It was taken inside the very guest house where Nick lived. Her father's note on the back read, "Observe closely. Timing matters. Behavior unusual." Romy felt a chill run down her spine. Her father had been watching, tracking, warning, and now, years later, it seemed those warnings had gone unheeded, or worse, ignored. She sat down at the study desk, spreading the photographs before her, cross-referencing dates and notes with the files she had uncovered in the drawer. A pattern began to emerge, subtle yet undeniable. Certain people, certain movements, certain interactions had repeated over time. And most disturbingly, one individual, someone in her immediate circle, appeared in multiple photographs, always at the periphery, always observing, always unnoticed. Romy's mind raced. Who could it be? Why would her father keep such meticulous records? And more importantly, why had no one ever spoken about them? Her father's foresight suddenly seemed almost prophetic. If he had known something was brewing, some danger lurking just beneath the surface, then the attacks that followed were not random. They were deliberate, targeted, and perhaps even preventable. She felt a pang of guilt. How had she missed the signs? How had her parents been silently trying to protect her and the rest of the family, only to fail? Determined to understand, Romy started to piece together a timeline. She meticulously compared photographs, notes, and phone records with what she knew about her family's daily routines. Slowly, a picture began to form, a sequence of interactions that hinted at manipulation, deception, and hidden resentment. And then came a new, chilling detail. A neighbor, one she had never spoken to closely before, revealed that they had seen unusual activity in the estate the week prior. Cars coming and going at odd hours. Strange deliveries. Unfamiliar faces at the perimeter. The kind of subtle surveillance that might have gone unnoticed by casual observers, but that suggested someone was planning, watching, waiting. Romy's heart pounded as she realized what this meant. The tragedy wasn't just about family tension. It wasn't only about her brother's possible involvement. There was an outside influence. Someone who had penetrated the family's life, the very estate that was supposed to be untouchable. Her father's foresight, his careful documentation, and his hidden warnings now made sense. He had been aware of the potential threat, and his cryptic notes and photographs were his way of leaving breadcrumbs, in case the unthinkable happened. But Romy was left with another terrifying thought. If her father had been this aware, and yet could not prevent what occurred, then the danger might still be out there. Someone who had been operating in silence, someone whose presence had gone unnoticed, could still be moving, still observing, still planning. She began to reach out to the friends and associates who had helped her in the previous days. Each conversation added more pieces to the puzzle. In one call, a former staff member revealed that Nick had been unusually secretive in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, spending hours alone in the guest house and receiving mysterious phone calls. In another, a distant relative mentioned odd behavior from her parents, a tension that wasn't typical for them, a sense that they were bracing for something they didn't want Romy or her siblings to know. And then came the first glaring contradiction. Law enforcement reports stated that the family had been home alone that night. Yet Romy now knew, from photographs and witness accounts, that there had been other people present. Not just incidental visitors, but individuals whose presence raised serious questions about the timeline and motive. The realization was staggering. The official narrative, the one presented to the public, the one the media echoed, was incomplete. It was missing critical information. And Romy knew that without addressing these gaps, the truth could never fully emerge. Determined to confront the reality, Romy made a decision. She would dig deeper. She would track down the people in the photographs, uncover the deliveries and unknown visitors, and try to reconstruct the hours leading up to the tragedy. It was risky, dangerous even, but the stakes were too high to do anything less. Her investigation led her to an unexpected source. A former assistant to her father, someone who had left the family's employ years ago but retained access to personal records. Through careful questioning, Romy learned about tensions between Nick and a mysterious business associate, one who had been involved in a series of financial and personal disputes. This associate had been in contact with Nick in the days leading up to the tragedy, though their exact interactions remained unclear. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. What had seemed like a simple, if tragic, domestic dispute was now taking on the contours of a calculated, layered event. And the more Romy uncovered, the more she realized that understanding Nick's role, and the role of those surrounding him, was only part of the story. The full truth extended far beyond the family, reaching into networks of influence, secrecy, and hidden grievances. By the end of the week, Romy felt the weight of everything she had learned pressing down on her. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, and terrified. Yet, for the first time, she also felt a glimmer of clarity. The photographs, the files, the witness accounts, they were starting to tell a story. One that had been deliberately hidden, one that could finally expose the real sequence of events and the motives behind them. And just as she began to feel a sense of control over the narrative, a new development arrived that would change everything. A call from someone claiming to have evidence she couldn't yet access. Proof of interactions on the night of the tragedy. Interactions that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her family, Nick, and the unseen forces operating around them. Romy's hands trembled as she listened. The caller refused to give details over the phone, insisting on a meeting. The gravity of it was clear. The truth she had been chasing, the secrets she had been uncovering, were about to become far more immediate, far more dangerous. She realized that uncovering the full story would not just reveal the motives and actions of that night. It could expose hidden threats, alliances, and betrayals that had festered for years, unknown to anyone outside the family. And she understood something else, something chilling. The path she was on would force her to confront people she had trusted, people she had never suspected, and possibly even her own assumptions about her brother. The meeting was set for dusk, a time when shadows stretched long across the streets, and the ordinary world felt slightly unreal. Romy drove cautiously, heart hammering in her chest, knowing that the information she was about to receive could change everything. It was a blend of fear and anticipation, the kind that makes each red light feel like a countdown, each passing car a potential threat. She arrived at a nondescript office building in a quiet part of town. Nothing about the exterior suggested significance, but the caller's insistence, the urgency in their voice, and the strange specificity of the meeting left her with no doubt. This was important. Inside, she was greeted by a figure partially obscured by shadows. The person's voice was familiar yet guarded, each word measured, as though speaking freely could ignite danger. "You don't know the half of it," they said immediately. "Everything you've seen, everything you've pieced together. It's true, but it's only part of the story." Romy's stomach twisted. She had been prepared for surprises, but not for this level of intensity. "Tell me," she said, almost pleading. "I need to know the full truth." The individual handed her a folder. Inside were documents, images, and recordings that Romy had never imagined could exist. Phone logs, hidden transactions, and surveillance records painted a picture of a network of influence and manipulation that extended far beyond the family estate. Her hands shook as she absorbed the information. Nick, her brother, was not acting in isolation. There were layers of planning, people involved behind the scenes, and motivations that were murky, convoluted, and intertwined with secrets long buried by her parents and even Nick himself. One recording made her blood run cold. It captured a conversation between two individuals discussing the estate, the family's routines, and the night of the tragedy in precise detail. The voice, low and measured, mentioned schedules, alibis, and contingency plans. Knowledge only someone with intimate access to the family could possess. Romy pressed for answers. Who are they? Why? How could they? The shadowed figure shook their head. It's more complex than you can imagine. This isn't just about family tension or inheritance. There are old grudges, hidden dealings, and alliances that your father discovered years ago. He tried to warn you, to warn all of you. But some people are very careful about hiding their tracks. The weight of realization hit Romy. Her father had known, had documented, had warned, but even that wasn't enough. The network of deceit and danger had been vast and meticulous. She flipped through photographs showing people arriving at the estate under false pretenses, delivery logs altered to hide movements, and phone records that contradicted official reports. Every new piece of evidence reinforced the growing suspicion. The night of the murders had been orchestrated with precision. Questions tumbled over one another in her mind. Had Nick been a willing participant, a pawn, or perhaps manipulated without fully understanding the consequences? Who else had access to the estate? And how had her parents, despite all their foresight, been unable to prevent it? The shadowed figure leaned closer. Your father left clues, yes. But he also underestimated one thing: how deep the resentment and ambition ran. Sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who can betray you in ways you never imagine. Romy's throat tightened. Betrayal. That word cut sharper than any other. Because in that moment, she realized the tragedy wasn't merely a crime of opportunity. It was deeply personal, rooted in layers of history, resentment, and secrets that spanned decades. She looked at the photographs again. Faces she had trusted, scenes she had overlooked, small details she had dismissed. All of it now screamed significance. Her father's notes, her mother's warnings, the cryptic photographs. Every clue was a fragment of a larger mosaic, one that painted a picture of planning, manipulation, and hidden motives. And the shadowed figure was right. The implications were terrifying. Every revelation suggested someone had been watching, waiting, and manipulating events with a calculated patience that made Romy question the foundation of everything she thought she knew. You need to be careful, the figure said, almost as an afterthought. Not everyone is who they appear to be. Some people will do anything to protect themselves, and they have been preparing for this moment for years. Romy's mind raced. She had suspected danger, had pieced together inconsistencies, and had begun to reconstruct the timeline. But this was beyond anything she could have imagined. The meeting ended abruptly, leaving Romy with more questions than answers, but also a sense of urgency she couldn't ignore. She had to act, to dig deeper, to follow the trail her parents had left, even if it led to confronting truths she wasn't prepared to face. On her drive back to the estate, Romy reflected on what she had learned. The tragedy had been orchestrated. Nick's role was unclear, but the network of influences surrounding him was complex, deliberate, and potentially dangerous. Her father's warnings were real, his foresight impressive, but even he could not fully protect the family from what had been set in motion. And yet, as she approached the estate, another chilling thought struck her. The danger wasn't over. The people who had orchestrated the events might still be active, still watching, still capable of further manipulation. She realized that uncovering the truth would not just reveal motives or identities. It could place her directly in harm's way. And yet, despite the fear, she felt a growing resolve. She could not allow the story to remain hidden. The memory of her parents, the knowledge of what they had tried to protect, demanded that she continue. Romy stepped into the estate, the evening shadows stretching across the walls, and knew one thing with absolute certainty. The next discovery would push the boundaries of what she had already learned. It would challenge her understanding of family, loyalty, and betrayal. And it would bring her face to face with a truth she could not ignore. The morning after her meeting, Romy awoke with a sense of dread that clung to her like a shadow. Even the sunlight streaming through the estate's tall windows couldn't penetrate the heaviness in her chest. Every sound, the chirping of birds, the distant hum of traffic, felt amplified, as if the world itself were warning her to pay attention. She knew she couldn't waste time. The information she had received the previous night demanded action. Each piece of the puzzle, each photograph, each note, was part of a larger web she had yet to fully untangle. The first step was to confront the inconsistencies in the timeline of the night her parents had died. Romy began by reviewing security footage she had been able to obtain with the help of trusted family contacts. The recordings were heavily redacted, with significant portions obscured or missing entirely. That, in itself, was suspicious. The missing segments corresponded exactly to the hours immediately preceding the tragedy. Her stomach churned. If someone had deliberately removed footage, it meant that the narrative being presented to law enforcement, and by extension, the public, was incomplete. There were movements, interactions, and visitors that no one had officially accounted for. She noted each anomaly meticulously. Doors opening when no one was supposed to be home, shadows passing through hallways, lights flickering at odd intervals. Every inconsistency reinforced the idea that the night had been orchestrated, that someone had planned the events with meticulous precision. Then came the first shocking revelation. One of the files she had obtained in the previous days contained a set of photographs taken from inside the estate. The images showed Nick, but not in the way she remembered. He was interacting with an unknown individual in the guest house, the same person mentioned in the previous day's meeting. The body language suggested familiarity, coordination, and secrecy. Romy felt a chill. Her brother had not acted alone, or perhaps he had been manipulated in ways she could not yet understand. But the presence of a second individual raised critical questions. Who were they? What role had they played? And how long had they been involved in her family's life without detection? She cross-referenced the photographs with phone records and noticed a pattern. Repeated calls between Nick and a number unlisted anywhere publicly. The timing was precise, almost ritualistic, occurring in the exact windows that corresponded to her parents' last known activities. The implications were terrifying. Someone had been monitoring the family, planning interactions, coordinating actions, all leading up to that night. And her parents, despite their vigilance, had been caught unaware. Romy's next move was to review every personal communication she could access. Emails, texts, even old messages stored on forgotten devices. What she found was alarming. Subtle warnings embedded in correspondence that hinted at tension, threats, and undisclosed conflicts. Some of the messages were cryptic, almost like code, while others were blatant enough to reveal fear and anticipation. It became clear that her parents had been trying to prepare her, her siblings, and perhaps even themselves for something inevitable. They had left breadcrumbs, warnings, and records. But the complexity and subtlety of these clues meant that they could easily be misinterpreted or ignored. The realization hit Romy hard. If her parents' attempts at foresight had failed, and if key players had operated in secrecy, then the danger might still be present. Someone who had orchestrated or facilitated the events could remain in the shadows, watching, waiting, and manipulating. Her mind went back to her brother, Nick. She wanted to believe he hadn't intended for things to go as they did. But the evidence was mounting against that hope. The repeated, coordinated actions, the unexplained communications, the inconsistencies in alibis, all suggested complicity, or at least involvement. Romy decided to confront him directly. She arranged a meeting in a neutral location, one that was private yet safe. The conversation was tense from the start. Every word, every pause, every glance carried weight. "Nick," she said, voice steady but urgent, "I need the truth. I need to know everything about that night." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Do you really think you can handle it?" he asked. "There's more to this than you know." Romy's stomach tightened. She had already seen the first layer of the story, but his words suggested depths she couldn't yet fathom. Over the next hour, he provided fragments, partial explanations, selective admissions, and cryptic warnings. It became clear that he had been involved, but perhaps not entirely by choice. There were elements of coercion, manipulation, and external pressure that she had not anticipated. Yet, the more he spoke, the more contradictions emerged. His account clashed with the evidence she had gathered. Certain timings didn't align. Descriptions of interactions didn't match photographs. And there were gaps, moments he couldn't or wouldn't explain. Romy realized something crucial. Uncovering the truth would not be simple. It would require navigating lies, half-truths, and deliberate obfuscation. She couldn't rely solely on her brother's account, no matter how much she wanted to. She would need corroboration. Multiple sources, tangible evidence, and a careful reconstruction of events. That night, Romy returned to the estate, exhausted but determined. She reviewed every document, every photograph, every recording once more. Patterns began to emerge, connections she had overlooked, and a narrative that suggested premeditation beyond her brother's actions alone. And then came the most disturbing realization yet. Someone had altered the environment of the estate to create confusion, misdirection, and plausible deniability. Furniture moved subtly, items relocated, even messages rewritten. It was as if the very house had been weaponized to hide the truth. Romy understood the stakes. She was uncovering a labyrinthine plot that extended far beyond her family. Each revelation was a step deeper into danger. Each truth risked exposure to forces that had already demonstrated lethal intent. And yet, she could not turn back. Her parents' lives, her siblings' safety, and the legacy of her family demanded that she continue. as she prepared for the next phase of her investigation, tracking every unknown visitor, reconstructing the movements of every individual, and seeking corroborating evidence. Romy felt the weight of the night pressing down on her. The secrets, manipulations, and betrayals she had uncovered were only the beginning. The investigation was no longer just an intellectual pursuit. It had become visceral. Every sound, every shadow, every passing stranger felt like a potential threat. Romy moved through her parents' estate with heightened awareness, her senses tuned to details that had once gone unnoticed. A picture crooked on the wall, a chair slightly out of place, a door that creaked differently. All became pieces of a complex puzzle she had no choice but to solve. Her next lead came unexpectedly. An old family friend, someone who had known the Reiners since before Romy could remember, reached out with information that would challenge everything she thought she knew. They had noticed discrepancies in Nick's behavior months before the tragedy, moments of secrecy that, at the time, seemed minor but now screamed significance. He wasn't himself, the friend said. He was calculating, always watching, always planning. I didn't understand it then, but now I see the signs. Romy listened carefully, taking notes. Each recollection was like another thread she could weave into the tapestry of that night. Her mind raced as she began connecting behaviors, conversations, and patterns that had once seemed trivial. Then came a critical breakthrough. She obtained a set of surveillance records from the surrounding neighborhood, footage that the initial investigation had overlooked. At first glance, the recordings seemed mundane. Cars driving past, joggers passing, a mail carrier delivering packages. But with careful review, Romy noticed anomalies. Vehicles parked outside the estate at odd hours. Individuals lingering near entrances. Movements that suggested observation rather than coincidence. Her pulse quickened. Someone had been monitoring the estate in the days leading up to the murders, someone with knowledge of the family's routines. The evidence suggested planning, patience, and a disturbing familiarity with the property. Romy realized that the danger extended beyond her brother. Nick's role was significant, but he was part of a larger web of influence and manipulation. Understanding the full scope of this network was essential, not just to explain the night of the tragedy, but to prevent further harm. She began cross-referencing the surveillance with phone records, delivery logs, and witness accounts. Patterns emerged. The timing of calls, the movement of vehicles, and the presence of unknown individuals corresponded to the hours leading up to the murders. Every detail pointed to meticulous orchestration. As she delved deeper, another revelation surfaced. Certain household staff members, long trusted and overlooked in the initial investigation, had been compromised. Their accounts contained inconsistencies, omissions, and subtle hints of involvement. Romy felt a sinking realization. Loyalty and trust within the estate had been fractured long before that night, creating vulnerabilities that had been exploited with precision. The complexity of the situation overwhelmed her at times. Nick's role, the external influences, the manipulated staff, it was a labyrinth of deception. But the fragments of evidence, when combined, painted a chilling picture. This was not a crime of impulse. It was premeditated, executed with cold calculation, and concealed beneath layers of secrecy. Romy's next step was to confront the implications. She realized that uncovering the truth would inevitably expose dangerous individuals, potentially provoking retaliation. The people behind the orchestration had demonstrated meticulous planning and a willingness to manipulate those closest to her. Any misstep could have serious consequences. She knew she had to be strategic. Gathering information alone was not enough. She needed corroboration, legal guidance, and allies she could trust implicitly. She began reaching out to trusted investigators, attorneys, and friends who had the discretion and expertise to navigate such a complex situation. Simultaneously, Romy continued to piece together the timeline of that fateful night. She compared alibis, cross-referenced communications, and reconstructed movements down to the minute. Every discrepancy, no matter how small, became a critical clue. She realized that understanding the exact sequence of events was key to identifying the orchestrators and uncovering the true motive. One discovery in particular left her stunned: a set of encrypted messages between Nick and an unknown contact. The content suggested coordination, planning, and preparation. The messages were meticulously timed, each sent to correspond with specific events at the estate. Romy's heart pounded as she decrypted portions of the communication, revealing hints of manipulation, instructions, and references to her parents' routines. The implications were clear. Nick had been influenced, guided, or pressured by someone external, someone with intimate knowledge of the family's life. The tragedy was not solely a result of internal conflict. It had been engineered. Romy felt a mixture of fear and determination. The network she was uncovering was dangerous, capable of operating undetected within her family's life. Yet, she could not turn away. Her parents' memory, the pursuit of justice, and the protection of her remaining family members demanded that she continue. As night fell over the estate, Romy sat surrounded by documents, photographs, and recordings. Each piece of evidence brought clarity, yet simultaneously deepened the mystery. The orchestrators were methodical, calculated, and patient. The layers of deception were intricate, designed to mislead, confuse, and conceal. And yet, amid the chaos, Romy began to see the outlines of truth, a path that could lead her to the people responsible, the motive behind the tragedy, and the critical decisions that had led to the deaths of her parents. But she also knew this path would be treacherous. Confronting the orchestrators, uncovering their intentions, and bringing the full truth to light would test her courage, resilience, and ability to navigate a web of manipulation that extended far beyond the estate. As she prepared for the next phase of her investigation, Romy realized one undeniable fact. The revelations she had uncovered so far were only the beginning. The real truth, the full story of betrayal, manipulation, and premeditation, was still hidden, waiting for her to unravel it. The following morning, Romy returned to the estate with a sense of grim determination. Each room felt like a vault of memory and menace. Even in daylight, the house seemed to hum with secrets, each corner promising revelation or danger. She moved carefully, as though the walls themselves might whisper truths she wasn't ready to hear. Her first priority was the guest house, where Nick had lived. The building had always seemed innocuous, a place for privacy, autonomy, and family independence. But now it loomed with a sinister undertone. Romy examined the space meticulously, noting every alteration, every item left behind. Small details leapt out at her. Furniture slightly out of place, papers with edges folded unnaturally, and personal items arranged in patterns that suggested surveillance or intentional signaling. It wasn't just the physical space that mattered. It was the history embedded within it. Romy thought back to interactions she had witnessed over the years. Nick's behavior, the intensity of his late-night activities, the cryptic phone calls, all of it now hinted at something deeper, something premeditated. She began cataloging her observations. Each note, each photographic record, each recorded memory was a thread she could follow. And soon, patterns emerged. Movements of individuals, timings of interactions, and unexplained absences converged into a timeline that suggested orchestration, not chaos. Her next lead came from an unexpected source. A former employee of the estate who had worked closely with her parents for years. The individual had initially been hesitant to speak, but Romy's persistence and evident determination convinced them to reveal what they knew. There were signs, the former employee said quietly, glancing over their shoulder as though the walls themselves were listening. Nick, he wasn't acting alone. There were meetings, arrangements, whispers about someone coming and going. I didn't fully understand it at the time, but now, it makes sense. Romy's pulse quickened. She had suspected outside involvement, but confirmation from someone who had been present in the house added a new layer of credibility. This was not mere speculation. It was corroborated observation. Together, they began to reconstruct interactions from the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Odd deliveries, unexplained guests, and cryptic phone calls all suggested planning. Each revelation added weight to the growing picture. The tragedy had not been impulsive. It had been engineered. Romy's thoughts returned to her brother. She wanted to believe that he had not intended the full scope of the horror. But the evidence, coordinated movements, strategic communication, and timing hinted at involvement, whether willing or coerced. And that realization filled her with both fear and determination. The morning gave way to afternoon as Romy examined more evidence. Photographs of visitors, phone logs, and small details she had previously overlooked coalesced into a narrative that was as chilling as it was intricate. Patterns emerged in the movement of individuals, showing coordination and timing that could not have been accidental. Then came the first critical discovery, a set of messages hidden in a secure account she had almost forgotten. The communications revealed discussions between Nick and an unidentified individual, instructions regarding actions in the estate, and references to her parents' routines. The careful planning, the attention to detail, and the manipulation suggested a level of orchestration that was both terrifying and methodical. Romy realized that uncovering the full story would require confronting layers of deception, some of which might involve individuals she had once trusted.